Welcome to the very first episode of Indifferent Strokes. I'm your host, Adrian Bailey, and I am excited to share some really valuable information with you that could potentially save your life or the life of someone that you love.
And this is fantastic that you got this started. My name is Charles Esenwa. I'm a stroke neurologist here in the Bronx, and I'm excited to go on this journey with you.
Thank you, Doc. To everyone, he's my personal doctor, and I know him, so I'm going to be calling him Dr. Charles for the duration of this podcast, all right?
That's exactly right. I go by Dr. Charles for the people that know me, and I'm also excited just to be here to support the community.
Thank you. Yeah, no, we're excited to have you. And for the people that are listening that are wondering why the name Indifferent Strokes, well, the truth is that many of us have a certain indifference to our health until something goes wrong. And by the time something goes wrong, it's too late. And so our goal is to provide you with some information to prevent that from happening. How do I know this? It's because it literally happened to me at 50 years old, feeling as vibrant, as youthful as I ever had. I was hit with a stroke out of nowhere, and it was pretty devastating. The entire left side of my body was paralyzed, and the doctors were telling me that I might be permanently disabled and never able to walk again. The doctors told me that I might be permanently disabled, but through methods that I currently teach others, I've been able to make a near full recovery. But this podcast is really all about breaking through that indifference and making you aware now about potential things that you can do in your life and changes that you can make to prevent this from happening, or to give you the best possible chance of preventing it from happening, right, Dr. Charles? Because nothing is 100%.
Nothing is 100%. And Adrian, I think your experience can teach a lot of people about the things that I see day in, day out, which is people coming in, just like what you described, with a devastating event that could potentially handicap them or leave them paralyzed on one side of their body for the rest of their lives. And so what you're trying to do here is absolutely something that I'm willing to support, because the thing that I want the most is to be out of a day job. If nobody came to the hospital with a stroke, I'll be super happy. And so if we can prevent every single stroke, if we could prevent some strokes that were to happen, that would be a job well done. So congratulations on getting this off the ground. The goal of this session is to talk about the stroke myths. So a lot of times people are indifferent about the possibility of having a stroke or possibility of having a heart attack because it's not near and dear to them. It's just not something that's a reality to them. And what you're trying to do is shed light on there are possibilities in life that are not obvious. And we want to shed light on the risk factors for stroke, and more importantly, the myths that people have around stroke and heart attack. Mainly, a myth is that I feel great. I don't really need to take care of my health, or at least check my blood pressure, because I feel great. And so stroke is just not something that is important to me. And I think what you just said is a reason why people should listen.
Sure. Yeah, no, I agree. And as somebody that lived my whole life, eating healthy, working out, never in my wildest imagination did I ever imagine that something like that would happen to me. And since then, I've been working with other people who have survived strokes as well, and none of them ever planned for it. I have yet to meet a person that was sitting there with their stopwatch like, any minute now, my stroke is going to happen, right? It doesn't go down like that. It comes out of the blue, and this is something that you really should pay a lot of attention to. So let's jump into some of those top 10 myths. And the biggest one I feel that I think most people think about is that strokes only happen to old people.
Yeah, and just to go back, when you said that people don't think about the possibility of having a stroke, I've never met anyone either that foresaw their stroke coming. And so, as you said, it just happens out of the blue. And unless we take steps to prevent something like this from happening, it can happen to anyone, really. And so it's not necessarily just people who are older, who are at risk. I'll give you an example. We see kids with stroke. We see 20-year-olds with stroke. We see 30-year-olds with stroke. It's true that the older you get, the more likely you are to have a stroke, or at least the higher the risk of stroke is. But there are young people out there, just like yourself, who are seemingly living a normal, healthy life who are at risk for stroke and they don't even know it.
Yeah, no, for sure. And so speaking about young people, so why is it that younger people are increasingly at risk nowadays?
It's a great question. Before we even talk about that, I think it might be a good time, Adrian, to really have people understand what a stroke is, because a lot of times when I talk to especially young people that are sort of immune to the devastating effects of stroke, people don't really understand what part of the body a stroke happens, why does a stroke happen, and therefore when we talk about people who are young or at risk of stroke, it doesn't really hit home. And so I think we should really spend a little bit of time just talking about what is a stroke and why does it happen to certain people. And so here I have just a model of a brain, right? So everyone has one of these. There are two portions of it. There's the right. So this is my right, there's the left. And the brain is the most needy organ in the body, meaning that it needs a lot of blood. And so there are a number of blood vessels that feed all of these regions of the brain. And so each one of these regions does something differently. So for example, this is the frontal cortex. This is the front of the brain here. This is the temporal lobe. This is the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe. So if a blood vessel that feeds any one of these portions of the brain gets blocked off, guess what happens? That part of the brain stops getting blood and people develop symptoms. And the symptoms that they develop are sudden. How quickly did you, Adrian, how quickly did it take you or the people around you to realize that you were having a devastating event?
So for me, I was on the phone, thank God, right? I was on the phone with my best friend and literally as we're talking, the phone dropped out of my hand and I was looking for it. I was like, where's my phone? Where's my phone? And he was on speaker and he goes, Adrian, why do you sound like that? And I said, I don't know. As it turns out, I was slurring my words. And I was like, why do I sound like that? And at first I thought maybe I was just like having like a hot flash or something. I thought, maybe I need to hop in the shower. This was the summer that happened in August. I went in the shower, turned on the cold water, got in the shower and dropped in the shower. And when I couldn't get up, that's when I knew something was wrong.
Yeah, and what you described is extremely common in that the symptoms just happen suddenly, absolutely suddenly. They don't develop over hours. They don't develop over weeks. Everything is totally fine. And then suddenly somebody loses the ability to move one side of their body. So what you're describing really is a very, very common symptom of stroke. And so if we pick up our brain model again, and we look at this red part right here, which is called the motor cortex. In your case, your left hand went weak first. Therefore, blood to the motor cortex got blocked off somehow. Most likely a blood clot blocked off the major artery that feeds this area of the brain. And because there's two hemispheres, the right controls the left side of the body. The left hemisphere controls the right side of the body. And so in your case, your right hemisphere suddenly stopped getting blood, your left hand dropped, and your left part of the face presumably got weakened. That's why you were slurring your words, which is one of the more common features of a stroke. So yeah, tell us, what did you experience right after that? Did you know you were having a stroke, or did the person around you? I still wasn't 100
again, because I didn't know much about stroke at the time, right? I've become more informed since the stroke about like what to look out for and that kind of thing. But until my girlfriend called me, my best friend who I was on the phone with, he got scared, luckily. And because he was asking me if I was all right, I kept telling him I was okay. And thank God he didn't listen to me. He got scared. He called my girlfriend, who called me on WhatsApp. And she said she saw my face and that the left side of my face had begun to droop and she knew what was happening. So she called 911, made sure that they came over there. And, thank goodness it happened, because part of me, if she hadn't done that, may have thought like, you know what, maybe I'm having a headache. I need to lay down and take a nap. And that could have been devastating. Right?
Yeah.
Devastating. So luckily, she was insistent that 911 come. They took me to the hospital, and I did get to the hospital within an early enough window to get what's called a TPA shot to clear out the clot. But even still, they ended up taking me to a different hospital in Fort Lauderdale because they thought there was going to be another procedure that they needed to do. It was a big deal, right? If you're listening to this, you do not want to go through this. It is And one of the things that also happens is after a stroke, especially when a doctor comes and tells you this is going to be permanent, you hear something like that, there is such an overwhelming sense of depression, right? You feel like your life is over. And, that's one of the things that I really work with people with right now, with helping them to understand your life isn't over, but at the end of the day, there's some things that you're going to have to do to potentially reinvent yourself, right? But ideally, what we want to be able to do is put both of us out of business and prevent that from happening at all, right? We don't want it happening to anyone, because I literally would not wish this on my worst enemy. I don't have a lot of enemies, but if I had an enemy, I would not wish this on them at all. It is just the most terrible thing. And so, even if you think you're healthy, even if you think you're doing well, I think it's really important to do whatever you can. And that leads us to myth number 2, is that you can't prevent strokes. It's going to happen, right?
Yeah.
So what do you say about that?
Your story is so powerful, right? And the fact that you've come out of this able to sort of be a beacon of light for others, because for the most part, when I see people have a stroke, most of them don't recover to their full ability, right? Not only is this sudden and dramatic, but also it's long lasting and sometimes and often permanent. The fact that you're here educating young middle-aged professionals like ourselves about stroke and it could happen to them, that in itself is a reason to applaud you. The first myth about age is clearly that's not true. But the second myth about preventing stroke is even more wrong, and it's even more hurtful to think that you cannot prevent a stroke, because if anything, we're much better able to prevent stroke than to treat it. So once a stroke happens, but like the way that it happened to you, once a blood clot or something blocks off the artery, we can sometimes go in with a clot busting medication. So I'll show up in the emergency room. Hopefully the person comes in time within 4.5 hours, but the quicker the better. We can give a medication that opens up the blood vessel that supplies blood to this part of the brain. And hopefully things sort of return to normal, which is what happened to you, right? There's another procedure that we can go in with a catheter and physically open up the blood vessel to restore blood flow. But really, at that point, for the most part, the part of the brain has already experienced some level of damage, right? By the time we're going in there with catheters and we are opening up blood vessels, again, it's one step too late. And ideally, we would have prevented this from happening. And so what can we do to prevent a stroke? So I already told everyone that stroke is caused by some sort of cutoff of blood flow to the brain. And so the biggest risk factors for cutting off blood flow to the brain are high blood pressure. High blood pressure is a silent killer for a reason, right? People feel great. Mm-hmm. I'm in my 30s, I'm in my 40s, I feel great. What are you talking about, a stroke? I'm young. And hey, maybe I have a little bit of high blood pressure. I haven't checked it in many years, but I feel great. By far, that is the biggest myth to stroke that there is. And high blood pressure accounts for about 80% of strokes. If people were much more likely to take their blood pressure, act on it when it's high, and control it, we could prevent, again, up to 80% of strokes. And so by far, the biggest risk factor for stroke is high blood pressure. And the biggest myth is that I feel fine, therefore I'm not at risk. That's not true. People feel totally fine with an astronomically high blood pressure. And the only time that they don't feel fine is when they have a stroke. And so if there's one thing that we can tell anyone out there is know your blood pressure, know your numbers. And if it's high, start to do something about it. And we'll get into that hopefully in the coming up.
Yeah, honestly, that was one of the things that, that I learned after spending time talking with you was about high blood pressure. And one of the things that really I felt was very informative for me was when you think about your blood pressure, you can take it now, you can take it a half an hour from now, and then 6 hours from now, and you can get different reading each time. And so it's important. You've gotten me to where I have a personal monitor where I check it often now just to make sure. You never know like how it's fluctuating, figure out ways to be able to track your blood pressure beyond just going to the doctor's office. Because if you just show up at the doctor's office, you could show up at one moment and it seems like your pressure's okay, but then later on during the day, it could spike and you're not really aware of that even happening, or there are some underlying things that you might not be aware of that could be causing that kind of stuff to happen. And so Some of the other things that you had mentioned, as well as high blood pressure, is also high cholesterol.
That's right.
So, eating, one of the things that I've been definitely doing is spending time eating better and trying to have an even better lifestyle. Thought I was eating healthy, but you can always still improve that.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So,
And it gets back to, just to add one more thing, at the heart of it, a stroke is related to unhealthy blood vessels, right? So what is it that makes blood vessels unhealthy? So when we talk about the health of blood vessels, that in general is called cardiovascular health, right? The heart, the vascular system. And so what are the things that make vessels unhealthy? Blood pressure, as we said. But if you take a look, for example, if this is just a pipe or a blood vessel, which that's all a blood vessel is, just a pipe. Over time, when people have high blood pressure, it starts to damage the pipe a little bit, right? Well, what if they have high cholesterol? Well, that gunk starts to build up. The cholesterol starts to build up. What if they have diabetes and the sugar in the blood is high? Over time, let's say 5-10 years of uncontrolled sugar, that blood vessel starts to narrow more and more and more. And guess what happens? All of a sudden, that blood vessel just blocks off and you lose flow to the brain. And so cardiovascular health is not something that you deal with or it doesn't happen over the course of a week. It takes years of healthy behavioral living or healthy lifestyle to prevent cardiovascular disease. And alternatively, it takes years of unhealthy factors like high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes to cause cardiovascular disease. Now, in some people, there are exceptions, right? There are other causes of stroke, like a blood clot can just come from the heart because of a condition called atrial fibrillation. That's very different. There's people that just have clotting disorders or they form blood clots in their body for other reasons. So again, there's a number of reasons why people can have stroke, but at the end of the day, what really the area that we can focus on in order to give us the best chances of living a long, healthy, productive life is to focus at least on the biggest sort of risk factors for stroke, which are high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes. If somebody's a smoker, they shouldn't be. That also damages the arteries. And healthy lifestyle absolutely helps with all those, right? Exercise, diet. There's a reason why we preach those things, is because they help all of those risk factors.
So let's get on to number 3, which is the stroke symptoms are hard to recognize. When it happened to me, I didn't immediately recognize them. So what are some signs that people should be on the lookout for so that they know to act quickly when something like that happens to them?
Stroke is a public health burden, and recognizing stroke as a public health burden because of this myth that stroke is bad, but I don't know how to tell a stroke, right? And we've pretty much all seen people out in the street where they're maybe paralyzed on one side of their body and they're sort of walking a little bit fragile because one side of their body is not moving as well. Those people have had a stroke in the past. And so how can we recognize when somebody around us, whether it's on the bus or on the subway or a loved one during a dinner, is having a stroke? We all know when somebody's having a heart attack, right, Adrian?
Yeah.
Yeah. You see it in the movies all the time.
They're coming to get me, Elizabeth. Yeah.
Everyone knows the universal sign of a heart attack. The stroke have a universal sign. It's interesting because there is not one universal sign for stroke. We do use some ways for people to remember how to spot a stroke. It's important to know that sometimes stroke does not have any pain associated with it. So again, it's not as urgent sometimes to people, whereas heart attack is super painful. It feels like somebody's sitting on my chest. I need to go to the hospital. Did you experience any pain, Adrian, when this happened to you?
None at all. Again, I thought maybe I did feel a little dizzy. That was the extent of it. I do know my words started to slur. I feel that's a big one.
Yeah.
And like to me, it felt like a hot flash.
Mm.
So, and I guess that sort of leads me to number 4. It says that if the stroke symptoms go away, that it's not a big deal.
Yeah.
And I've heard people say that if the symptoms pass quickly, that you're in the clear, but is that reality?
It is not reality. That is also a big myth. So let's just spell out the symptoms so that we provide some value to our listeners. So
sure.
As a stroke neurologist, I study the brain, right? I kind of understand what symptom to look for. And we already talked about if one part of the brain stops getting blood, it starts to shut down and people develop symptoms. So you don't have to be a stroke neurologist like me to understand when a stroke is happening. You really just have to understand a basic mnemonic or a basic set of words. And those are be fast, BEFAST. So when spotting a stroke, you have to be fast. So remember, be fast. So these are the symptoms that will tell you that somebody around you may be having a stroke. So B stands for balance. So if somebody suddenly develops balance problems, like they're walking fine and all of a sudden they can't walk and they look like they're drunk, that might be a stroke. So balance. E is for eyes, sudden vision loss, right? So if the stroke happens in occipital lobes, people lose vision. And so E is for eyes or some sort of vision problem, sudden blurry vision, vision loss. F is for face. You said it when your girlfriend called you had a facial droop. So usually people will have kind of one part of their face would droop a little bit. And that is a very common symptom of a stroke. A is for arm weakness. Remember that the brain, sort of one side of the brain manages the other side of the body. And so usually when people develop weakness from a stroke, it's on one side of their body. And so you ask them to lift up their hands and one arm is sort of drifting down. So that is arm weakness. S, slurred speech. You had slurred speech. T is time to call 911. So even though we don't have a universal, what we call Levine sign or universal holding the chest sign, we do have be fast. And if people just remember balance, eyes, face, arm, speech, time to call 911, they should be able to spot a stroke, because most times what happens is something happens to a loved one, a family member at the dinner table, right? And you think that they're just, they just had too much to drink, or this will pass. Their face is droopy. But if you recognize, oh no, that droopy face is part of BFAST, that might be the difference between somebody who lives a productive life for the rest of their life or somebody who unfortunately spends the rest of their life in bed because they can't move the right side of their body. So time to call 911 and getting to the hospital is absolutely critical. Why? So that I can do my job to treat that stroke as soon as possible. And sometimes if the symptoms go away, to answer your initial question, that could be kind of like an early warning system that things are going to get much worse, kind of like a pre-tremor to a major earthquake. You have these little tremors beforehand, they go away. You have little tremors, but if you were to recognize those as real and serious, you may be able to actually prevent the big ones. So we actually act in as much urgency in these little tremors, which are called TIAs. The same way we take those as urgently as we take care of real strokes.
Definitely better safe than sorry, right?
Absolutely.
Because if you show up and they go, oh, you're okay, fine. But if you ignore it and you do something like I came really close to doing, like taking a nap, like I might have slept for hours, who knows if I would have even woken up, right? So don't take time, listen, be fast. Let's get into a little bit about stroke recovery, right? So I think this is one of the most discouraging myths, is that what can you tell us about recovery after a stroke?
Yeah, recovery is, and you're probably more of an expert to talk about this because you're living it. You're living what recovery with stroke looks like. And there is a level of recovery. So the couple things that people should understand about stroke recovery. Number one is that the brain does not grow new cells, right? So it's not like, so the part of the brain that's injured will heal, but it won't regenerate. And so recovery, therefore, unlike the stroke symptoms, which are sudden, recovery is long and a slow process. And it takes a lot of training, because what you're doing to the brain is you're not growing new parts of the brain. You're actually reorganizing the way that the networks in the brain are working. And therefore, learning how to read again, learning how to walk again, doing the therapy that takes weeks and then following up for months on end. That recovery process, Adrian, as you can tell our listeners, it takes months. Sometimes it even takes years, but it's the dedication to that process that's so important. And what I tell a lot of patients is that the recovery could be a marathon, and we're just on mile one. And if you are sort of depressed or not feeling well, it's going to be very difficult to keep that marathon going. And I think that's where people like you come in, to encourage others who have had a stroke to know that there is an end in sight, a finish line where you can get to better And if you don't keep running that race, you may actually continue staying the way that you are now.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think that's so important. And that's one of the things that I definitely try and get across to some of the fellow stroke survivors that I talk to who have given up hope, right? And once you've given up hope, it's over. So what I try and do is see what happened as not the end, but as the beginning of a new chapter. And so I think it's really important for people to understand maybe that old you is gone, but that doesn't mean that you can't reinvent yourself and reinvent a new version of you from here on moving forward. And I think that's really important for, for people to understand. And there's the whole idea of neuroplasticity where the brain can create new connections. And so who knows what new connections you can form, but you have to be actively pursuing those things in order to make that happen. We're at myth number 9, where we say stroke recovery is really only about physical health. And I think we've kind of like tapped into that a little bit. And let's move on.
And I would love to hear your experience on that, because what I've heard a lot is, when a stroke happens, it doesn't just affect the person with the stroke, right? There's kind of like a domino effect where all the people around you are affected, right? All the loved ones, their interaction with you, your economic stability, your sort of relationships, everything is affected. And therefore, the psychological toll of a stroke is massive. And so I would love to get your take. Having lived it, tell us a little bit more about that, because I think people kind of understand the physical side of things, but even myself as a stroke doctor don't really understand the psychological toll.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's when you're in the hospital and they give you a prognosis like you may never be able to walk again. And, one of the scariest moments was when they covered my eyes and they started poking my feet and my hand and asking me if I felt anything, and I didn't. I had only seen stuff like that in movies, like the football movies where somebody gets hit in a big shot, you know what I mean? Next thing you know, they're paralyzed, and you're just like, is this really happening? It's so surreal. And then, like you said, my family was there, like my girlfriend's there. The doctor's telling me I'm never going to walk again. I'm looking at her like, what are we going to do? And she's looking at me and she's telling me, don't worry, I'm going to be with you no matter what, right? And then there's this dark voice that kind of comes in and goes, she's not going to stay with you. She's saying that now, but when she has to start wheeling you around in a wheelchair, she's going to be out. And, I'm thinking like, am I going to be a burden to my family? And that voice will try and come in and tell you your life is over. This is it. You get angry. You get angry with life. You get angry at God. You get angry at everybody. And you're just like, how could this happen to me? But for me, there came a point where, luckily about 15 years ago, I was a motivational coach, and I had put together like an audio program that I used to train my clients to. And I started listening to that in the hospital. And it was so important because there were so many powerful things that I put in there, motivational things that spoke out against that voice. So every time that voice tried to tell me, that's it, your life is over, the stuff that I put in that audio was like, no, it's not. And it got to the point where I began to look at it as a challenge, that if I could beat this, anything was possible. And once I began honestly looking at it in that light, I feel like that's when kind of like the tide turned a bit. And, I ended up walking out of the hospital 6 days after they told me that I would never be able to walk again. And technically they had to wheelchair me to the door of the hospital because they're not allowed to let you walk to, out of your room. But they wheeled me there. I got up, I walked out of the hospital. And then the very next day, I had some friends that were kind enough to let me stay with them in Fort Lauderdale. I went into, they had a gym in their garage. I jumped right into the gym. I turned that audio on and I couldn't do much. It was very humbling because I went from being able to lift weights and doing all kind of stuff. Now I'm just like pulling on like a workout band. But as I was pulling on that workout band and doing whatever I could, I just was determined that I was not going to let the stroke be the end of my story. It's meant the world to me to be able to help others. And so if you do know someone that has had a stroke, I think it's important for you to like make sure to keep their spirits up. Mm-hmm. And I know that sounds hard and you want to look at them and you feel bad for them, but at the same time, you don't want to like be too easy on them either. You want to make sure that they are in good spirits and that they don't lose hope. because, once you lose hope, like I said, it's almost like all hope really does become lost. And the longer you sit around depressed, I feel like the longer the road for your recovery to come back is going to be. And like, I'm just so thankful that I had something available to me there in the hospital on my phone that allowed me to be able to quickly change my mindset as early as possible. And so those are some of the things that I'm working on, is being able to try and get some of the things that I use in the hospitals to be able to help other stroke survivors as soon as possible. So those are some of the things that I would say that was kind of like my take on it.
So it is a psychological battle, right? I mean, it really is. And all the factors that we rely on for support, right? Like our family, our job, or the things that give us sort of a value in the world, they completely start to break down, right? Like your understanding of what your place is in society changes. And I think that that's such a big emotional and psychological toll because it's so sudden. Nobody can prepare for a stroke, and it really impacts everyone around you. And so that psychological component is such an underestimated piece of stroke. And ultimately, it takes people like you to really shed light on it, because we can't really measure that as robustly as we could measure looking at a scan or doing an exam. That these factors, the well-being of somebody and the value that they have in themselves, and sort of the spiritual side as well, these are very hard to measure. Ultimately, you're at a place where you can talk about it because you are a miracle story, honestly. And just remind me, how long ago was the stroke for you?
It's been 8 months now.
It's been 8 months. And most people, if I see 100 people with this type of a stroke that you had, I would say that 99% of them are in a place that is, how should I say this, much more difficult than yours. And even so, it's still very difficult for you, right? It's not like this has been a walk in the park. And so,
no, not by far.
Anything but, right? Anything but.
Yeah,
the difference being that now you're at a place where you've healed yourself, you've healed your mental well-being, and also your body has just that capacity to heal in a way that most people don't. And at the end of the day, we're here to support people in two ways. We're here to say life is not over when you had a stroke, that there is a new version of you that is at hand that you can wield yourself to. And number two is there are things that you can do to not even have to go through this. And there are things that you can do to put yourself in a place where your family doesn't have to go through this. And there are things that you can do that you can instill in your life, in your household, where your wife or your husband doesn't have to go through this, or your kids don't have to see this, or there are things that we can do. My example is this: when you got a brand new car, you drive it off the lot, right? You got a nice car, you paid a lot for it. Let's say you hit 30,000 miles and you haven't changed the oil on it, or you haven't changed the tires on it, and you're like, but it drives great, everything's good, right? You hit 50,000 miles, you're like, it drives just the same as I took it off the lot. And guess what happens at 80,000 miles? It's sudden. Boom. You're on the side of the highway. Boom, tires blown.
If you get to 80,
big car accident. Yeah, exactly. Big car accident. Why? It's very obvious, right? We didn't take care of it. Why would we treat our bodies in any way differently, right? Why would we keep saying, I'm healthy, I feel great, but yet your blood pressure's out of control and your sugar's out of control and you're smoking cigarettes? Maybe not. Maybe all those things are not true, but why wouldn't you even get it checked out, right? Like, you would still take your car at the 30,000 mile tune up, even if everything is great. You still want them to say everything is great.
They sit there, they go out every weekend, they polish, they clean their car, they want to make it look nice. And I'm like, man, that's time that you could be doing, exercising, or that's extra money that you could be, spending. Because, let's be truthful. Like, a lot of Black and brown people that look like us sometimes they get scared to go to the doctor. It's almost like they don't want to know.
I don't want to know.
Like,
I don't want to know, because if I know, then I gotta deal with that. But listen,
you got to do something about it.
So much better to deal with it up front than to have to relive your story, Adrian. And it's like, that actually is the biggest myth, right? Like, I don't want to know. It's at the end of the day, what you're saying is something I encounter. I have some of that too sometimes, right? Like, I don't want to weigh myself, or I don't want to take my blood pressure. Why? I'm afraid of the number. But is that a logical explanation when you know that potentially what can happen is have something that's devastating and that you could have prevented. It's not logical. And so I don't know how to counter that, Adrian. I really don't know how to counter that sort of mindset. But the only thing I'll say is that don't fear the number, fear the possible consequence that can happen if you don't deal with it, right? Don't fear going for the 30,000-mile checkup. That's not what you should fear. Fear being on the side of the road with a blown tire and potentially have caused an accident because your tire blew it while you were driving 65 miles an hour. That's the part that we need to fear. It's a reality. I see it day in, day out. I've seen thousands of people with stroke, right? And as you said, when we started this podcast, nobody ever said, oh, I'm going to have a stroke at some point. Nobody ever said, I expected this to happen. Never have I encountered that.
Yeah, never. So, I mean, that's one of the reasons that we started this, that we got here together today. Hopefully someone out there will schedule an appointment, will go and look into some other things that they can potentially do to be able to prevent this from happening, not just to you, because like you said, when something like this happens, it's not just you that gets affected. It's your children, it's your family, your life, all of the people around you, your friends, right? Everybody ends up suffering when this kind of thing happens. And there are some small, minor things in the grand scheme of things that can be done to help put you in a better place so that doesn't happen. So with that, Dr. Charles, I want to thank you so much for sharing your expertise today. I've learned even more, and I really hope that our listeners did too. And if you guys would like to learn more about Dr. Charles and his incredible work, the guy's a literal genius, and what he's doing, I'd like to ask you to check out his website. It's Smarts Health. That's smart with an S at the end, smartshealth.net. And if you know someone who could benefit from this information, please share this podcast with them. You never know whose life you might impact.
Love it. Let's not be indifferent.
Yeah,
let's be impactful. Let's be impactful. Adrian, thank you so much for putting this together. I can't imagine how many people this potentially could help. And I just commend you for the journey that you've taken. Everything happens for a reason, and your reason now is clear why this potentially, why you're in this path right now. I think it's clearly to help others.
Absolutely. And I have been just really so thankful to be in the position to be able to do this. And I'm looking forward to, to hearing from anyone. Comment on this podcast if you'd like. If there's someone in your life that you'd like to just share any of your own personal stories, and if this has helped you or your family out in any way, when you let me know those things, that's one of the things that makes it all worthwhile. Charles, thank you so much. It's been great, man.
No, it's been my pleasure.
Until the next time.
Absolutely.